Yeah, that's a good idea. That's fine. Where are you? That's fine. That's, oh yeah, yeah. That looks a lot better, doesn't it? Got the G that disappeared for some reason. Jim, am I supposed to use this to move the slides, or I just go up and down? This is for somebody else.
That's for the projector.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
I'll just put it over
you
here.
should be able to
Up
just
and down
go.
with, there we go. That's
That it? Yeah.
perfect, yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
I think that's the problem right there. It's not activated.
Hey, welcome everybody. Glad to have you here to participate in our first of our lecture series for Archives Month, State Archives. Today we are privileged to have Carol Edison talk to us about gravestones. Carol worked at the Utah Arts Council, the folk arts program, from 1978 through 2011, and she was the director of the folk arts program from 1984 to 2011. She has a lot of experience and a real interest in folk arts and what that tells us about the people. Are you having a hard time hearing me? Yeah. Really? Okay. All right, I'll talk into the mic. Carol has a real interest in folk art and what that reveals about what folk art tells us about the common people. And one of her areas of specialty is is gravestone art, and she's the foremost expert in the state on gravestone art and has studied extensively and presented extensively on it. So, and I think she's just doing a little tiny slice of what she knows today, but I think you'll find it interesting. I also want to note that the exhibit that we're installing out in the lobby here is an exhibit that Carol put together in 1979 in the Glendenning House Gallery, where the Utah Arts Council offices are. So, and that material came to us here at the State Archives, and it was still, things were still in their frames. We had pretty much the whole exhibit there. We decided, well, why don't we put this up again and give people another chance to see this material about gravestone art. So if you have a chance on your way out, you might just wander around. You'll see some interesting stuff there, and that is all stuff that Carol collected and put together as an exhibit. So I guess we'll just turn it over to Carol. And I do want to note that some of the funding for our Archives Month programs has come from the Utah Humanities Council. The Utah Humanities Council empowers Utahns to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. And so they gave us money to help publicize our programs this month. I also want to ask that you fill out our questionnaire on the table there in front of you to give us a little bit of feedback about our lecture series so that we can make improvements in the future. So thank you. And here, Carol.
First of all, thanks to Alan and all of you guys here at Archives. You've been welcoming to me and made a place where I can continue to do a lot of the things I care about. So thank you very much. And the topic changed a little bit from the advertisement to what we're doing today, and that's because we have another gravestone expert here, Alan, who did an incredible presentation last year with all the basics and the overview, and I thought silly to go over the same ground. So I decided to share with you a presentation I made a while back about the Carvers in Sanpete County. I'd kind of saved those guys as the last ones that I did intensive research on because I knew there was such a wealth there with the early construction of the Manti Temple and all of the handwork that went into that and the great stone in the area. It was a gem I kind of saved, and I had a really fun time when I finally got to it. So what I'm going to share today is that presentation, and I half apologize because I'm going to read it rather than just talk about what I'm showing you, but I'm doing that because I want to get through a lot of information. If I just start talking, you guys will be here till dinner time, and you'll get really bored by then. So we're going to look at men who left their mark, 19th century gravestone carvers in Sanpete County. Don't we all love PowerPoint? It does what it wants. Okay. Sanpete County has long been known for its abundance of well-preserved 19th century structures. Its classically designed Mormon villages are filled with homes, churches, and community buildings made by the pioneer craftsmen who made the area their home. There are several reasons why such an abundance of 150-year-old handcrafted beauty exists. First, these structures wouldn't have been built without the many local deposits of fine oolitic limestone that are found in the area. Secondly, the stone wouldn't have proved as useful without the skilled pioneer stoneworkers who knew how to quarry, cut, and build with stone. And thirdly, much of the built environment wouldn't still exist if Sanpete hadn't been a bit off the beaten track in an area with slower growth, a slower economy, and less new construction. Sanpete's 19th century gravestones represent another aspect of the county's rich material culture, hand carved by the same first generation craftsmen who built the lovely homes and churches we all cherish. Some of these carvers were original settlers, while others were called to the region specifically to work on the Manti Temple. Using the same oolitic limestone chosen for the temple, they left their mark through the hundreds of beautiful gravestones they crafted to commemorate the lives of their families and neighbors. Today, there are 19 cemeteries in Sanpete County, both active and abandoned, and about half of them still have large numbers of handcrafted gravestones that can tell us a lot about life in 19th century Utah. Gravestones provide not only a tangible reminder of our deceased family and friends, but also a wealth of information about the community and its culture at the time they were made. Their words and symbols communicate family relationships, ethnic heritage, religious beliefs, and settlement history. Materials design and production techniques reveal occupational and economic history, community traditions, and artistic heritage. After studying the ways people choose to honor and memorialize those closest to them, it often reveals communities' real concerns, core beliefs, and intrinsic values. The story of Sanpete's cemeteries range from tales of unplanned graveyards, graveyards that had to be abandoned as towns grew around them, floods that washed away tombstones, and vandalism that destroyed markers. But it's also a story of well-planned, well-maintained, and beautifully restored places of final rest, and the story of talented stoneworkers and the legacy of beautiful artistry that remains for us to enjoy. Markers, tombstones, and headstones are among the names used interchangeably when referring to gravestones. During the 19th century, tombstone was likely the most common term. Headstone usually referred to the marker placed at the head of the deceased that was typically paired with a smaller footstone that often features the deceased initials. You can still find footstones in some of the smaller cemeteries, like the Freedom Cemetery pictured here. A few cemeteries, like the one in Wales, still have natural vegetation, mostly bare earth and seasonal weeds. Occasionally, you can even find grave sites with earth mounded over the grave, a very old manner of marking a burial and a style of burial that was common in Sanpete during the 19th century. The earliest Sanpete markers, like the one on the left, were made from oolitic limestone using a hammer and chisels by a craftsman who called himself a tombstone maker. After the railroad came, carvers switched to imported marble, like the one on the right, because marble was harder and believed to be better. They imported carloads of marble as well as pre-carved markers that only needed to have the name and dates chiseled in, and they called themselves marble cutters. Though much of their work looked just like the work found across the country, they were careful to import markers with biblical symbols that had meaning for local folks. And they continued to use local stone to create bases for their marble gravestones. There's one easy way to determine who carved some of these beautiful gravestones. It was not uncommon during the 19th century for carvers to identify their own work, but just a few of Utah's Sanpete century markers are actually signed. The marker on the left is a marble one in the Mount Pleasant Cemetery signed by Elias Morris, a Welch carver who established a company in Salt Lake that shipped markers throughout the Intermountain West. The one on the right is found in Fountain Green, and it was made and signed by Arthur Henry, whose father, Daniel, worked on the Manti Temple before moving to Richfield, where he established a family-run regional monument company. There's also a group of markers in the Spring City Cemetery that are signed with the name T.T. Howe, Spring City. Though it appears Howe spent some time in Sanpete, the only reference I can find about him is a notation in the Utah Gazetteer of 1890 saying that he was a stonecutter in Spring City. His work is similar to that produced by another regional company, Provo Marble Works. Maybe he worked for them, saw an opportunity in Sanpete, and spent a year or two in the area carving markers before moving on. Or perhaps he was an itinerant carver just passing through who stayed long enough to carve a dozen markers. At any rate, his work is beautiful, very traditional, and it always features the biblical symbols that people wanted to express their religious beliefs. Undoubtedly, the most well-known Sanpete carvers are members of the Perry family. Edward Lloyd Perry, the master builder of the Manti Temple, and his sons Edward T., John L., and Bernard. The Perrys were from Wales and from a long line of stone workers. E.L. had served as the master mason for the St. George Temple and other major buildings in Dixie before being called to Sanpete. While living and working in the area, the Perrys gained ownership of one of the major local quarries, the Sanpete White Oolite Company. After completion of the temple, the Perrys decided to stay in Manti, where they established a business doing stonework. They advertised as both Manti Marble Works and as Perry and Sons, masons and monumental stone cutters. The top two photos show men at work in the Perry quarry circa 1900. Bottom left is a family portrait of Edward Lloyd Perry with his 4 sons, 3 of whom followed him into the stone business. And the photo on the right is of Edward Thomas Perry, E.L.'s oldest son, with samples of the decorative stonework for which their family company was well known. The Perry markers were carved from either oolitic limestone from their quarry or from marble, and they are easy to identify because of the quality of the stone and the skill of the lettering. You can still find a few markers signed with Manti Marble Works or an occasional marker signed by one of the Perry sons. But despite these few examples, signed work from Elias Morris, the Henrys, T.T. Howe, and the Perrys, in Sanpete, signed gravestones are really the exception rather than the rule. The majority of Sanpete's 19th century markers are unsigned, creating a wonderfully challenging and exciting journey for those of us who appreciate this artistry and want to discover the artists. Since I began studying Utah gravestones over 30 years ago, I've been trying to solve a wonderful mystery. I documented a group of gravestones carved by the same hand in the Rockville and Grafton cemeteries that included one marker with the signed initials WKB. I've located more of those markers in places like Kanosh, Holden, Oak City, Nephi, and even Pioche, Nevada. To my delight, I found at least 5 markers that were obviously by the same hand in the Manti Cemetery. The only pioneer I could ever find with these initials was William Kilshaw Barton, a merchant who lived in Manti and who didn't sound like a very promising candidate. But after finding the markers of Manti, I started digging into Barton's history and was delighted to find this reference in his 1876 journal. Quote, "During January and February and the early part of March, my son James Arthur and myself finished up and cut out some very handsome gravestones and a beautiful monument. The monument work $150, the gravestones from $75 down to $10 where lettered." I can't tell you how exciting it was to finally find the elusive WKB. Was watching for him everywhere. In Manti, William Kilshaw Burton was known as a businessman and a jack of all trades. He was the fellow who originally owned the Temple Springs, a house painter, sheepman, inventor, and confectioner. He had also been credited with carving the clasp hands above the doorway of the Manti Tabernacle, a fact that was just recently corroborated during the renovation of this tabernacle this summer. Take a look at the clasp hands from the Manti Tabernacle on the left. Compare them with the clasp hands found on the signed gravestone in the Rockville Cemetery on the right. There seems to be little chance that the carver of gravestones in southern Utah was anyone but William Kilshaw Barton, particularly when you look at the cuffs. I think that's the real giveaway. Barton was an interesting fellow, originally from Lancashire, England. His father was a printer. You can see that in his lovely lettering. And he worked at that trade until the age of 20 when he came to the U.S. On his way to Utah, he stopped for a while in Canesville, where he worked as a painter, a waiter, a baker, ran a boarding house, and sold lemonade and cakes on the street using his own recipe for lemonade powder. Once in Salt Lake, he harvested ice from the canyons and made ice cream that he sold outside theaters. Reaching Sanpete in 1858, he, quote, "painted, plastered, doctored, helped survey Manti, led the Manti choir, was in the militia, served on the town board and school board, acted in and directed plays, was a singer and an organ player, distilled spirits, and had a confectionery store that offered his own homemade ice cream." These guys were just all so busy. Sometime among all these activities, he cut stone for the Manti Temple, carved the clasp hands above the door of the tabernacle, and carved gravestones. His sons also involved in stonework. John Henry and Ethelbert were quarrymen, while James Arthur helped him cut the stones. The fact that James Arthur was also a freighter may help explain why the Barton stones can be found in such faraway cemeteries. Notice the similarity in the style between the WKB marker from Grafton on the left and those on the right that are from his native Lancashire. The markers in the Fairview Cemetery provided another interesting challenge, the unsigned work of two distinctive carvers found exclusively in the older, lower portion of the cemetery. Sometime in the 1980s, I met a gentleman in the cemetery who told me that a man named Westwood had carved some of the markers in the old section, including his own gravestone. That's a story you hear now and then, and I think it really did happen. Another clue came from Tom Carter, an architectural historian and folklorist who's done a lot of research into Sanpete material culture. He told me that one of the Fairview carvers might be a fellow named Austenson, a man who'd lived on the road to the cemetery and had built a classic Norwegian barn there that still stands today. But I had no real evidence that either of these men were gravestone carvers until I did a lot more digging. I identified Richard Webley Westwood as the full name of the man who supposedly carved his own gravestone. And after locating that gravestone, I had an idea of what to look for and was able to find a number of markers that appeared to have been carved by the same hand. Westwood was from Worcestershire, England, and was just 14 years old when he lost his parents to cholera in St. Louis as they were journeying toward Utah. He ended up going to Springville and living with an uncle, where he met and married Catherine Dolan. They made their home in Fairview, where he was the justice of the peace, an actor in many local plays, a poet, and someone known for his love of Shakespeare. Although there is no evidence that he was ever trained as a carver, the beauty of his gravestone carving speaks for itself, particularly through the marker on the right, an impressive piece carved for his wife, Catherine Dolan Westwood. It's interesting, sometimes the markers carved for a stone carver's wife are the ones that really give you the keys of the kingdom. They confirm that that's their work, and this is kind of the limits of the beauty that they could create. Westwood was also one of the ready men who was called on when when there were Indian troubles. Among the gravestones he carved is the one on the right, carved for the John Givens family, who were killed in an early Sanpete conflict with local Utes. Note that a military marker provided well after the fact was installed in front of the old marker, and you can also see the footstone. Perhaps Westwood's personal knowledge of this tragedy helped launch his gravestone carving career, since this marker seems to be the oldest one he produced. As for the other group of markers in Fairview, it turns out that the Norwegian farmer Niels Peter Austenson was indeed a gravestone carver, a fact I was finally able to confirm in an obscure local history publication about Fairview's pioneer heritage. In the publication, Austenson was simply listed as both a cooper, a maker of wooden barrels, and a maker of tombstones. His work is quite beautiful, especially the flowing curves of flowers and vines found along the top edge. Given the skill exhibited in much of his carving and the fact that he came to Utah in his 30s, it appears he may have been trained in carving in his homeland. Notice the similarity in style between the 19th century Norwegian gravestones at the top left of this page and the three Austenson Fairview markers along the right edge of the screen. The markers along the top are from Gulbrandsen, Norway, Austenson's home region. It's likely that the traditional skills he learned there in both wood and stone are reflected in his Utah legacy, his still standing historic barn, and in about 24 limestone gravestones in the lower section of the Fairview Cemetery. You can see the barn there in the middle, and this is a very bad photo, but it's an incredible structure with this beautiful stonework on the bottom layer and then the wood top. We're only partway through, guys. There's more cemeteries to come. In the old Ephraim Cemetery was one of the oldest burial places in the valley. There are at least 3 pioneer carvers whose work is still well represented. They are Danish carver Lars Brine Holt and his son JPL, or Peter, Scotsman Parlin McFarlane, and Parlin's brother-in-law, Englishman Alfred Bailey Sr. Today, the Brine-Holt markers are the largest surviving group, while just a handful of the McFarlane and Bailey stones remain. The Brine-Holt family, a family of stoneworkers, immigrated from Denmark to Sanpete in 1867. Lars, the father, top left, was in his 50s when they reached Sanpete. His 2 oldest sons, JCL, top right, and JPL, bottom right, were in their 20s. All three worked on the Manti Temple. JCL, or Jens Christian Larsen Breinholt, worked on the Richfield Tabernacle, and JPL, Jens Peter Larsen Breinholt, they made things so hard. What do you think they called each other at home? Worked on the Snow Academy. Lars is known to have carved gravestones, and it's likely that JPL was also in the gravestone business since he inscribed and sold imported monuments in Ephraim during the 1880s. He is pictured in his monument yard on the bottom right. Several generations followed in their footsteps, and there were Breinholts making gravestones in central Utah until the end of the 20th century. The Breinholt gravestones in the old Ephraim Cemetery are easily identified. Some are simple vertical tablets, others are four-sided monuments, and the most impressive ones are Gothic in style, having triangular canopies with columns on the sides that almost look like miniature churches. Breinholt had a very distinctive way of carving several of the elements on his gravestones. The carving of the word in, the treatment of in memory of, recognizable lettering and script, and one of these symbols near the base, a rising sun, a cross on a hill, or a simple geometric design, also help identify this very fine work. According to family history, Lars had a premonition that the end was near, and about a month before he actually died. This prompted him to have his coffin made, which he slept in the front room, according to one report, and to carve his own gravestone, task he accomplished just before he took sick. As his son JCL wrote, quote, "He had everything well arranged." Notice that Denmark spelled Danmark, not uncommon with the first generation of pioneers. Also note that the modern granite replacement stone, likely sandblasted by one of his great-great-grandchildren who carried on the monument business, repeats the sunrise-sunset motif found on the original marker. Farmer and physician Parlin McFarlane, isn't that a great name? Was trained as a stonecutter during a 5-year apprenticeship in Glasgow, Scotland. He came to Sanpete in 1854, where he became very active in public life, ultimately serving as probate judge, county commissioner, justice of the peace, notary public, and as mayor of Ephraim for 14 years. McFarlane's experience learning to carve in Scotland is obvious as one compares his Sanpete marker on the left with its pointed profile and its center inset with scalloped edges to the 1880s marker on the right from his native region of Lancashire. McFarlane originally settled in Gunnison, where his Scottish wife died a few years after he arrived. He subsequently moved to Ephraim, where he married an Englishwoman, Louisa Bailey. While serving the public in many municipal capacities and sometimes carving gravestones, he is credited with having taught Louisa's brother, Alfred Bailey Sr., to carve gravestones. Englishman Alfred Bailey Sr. was born in Warwickshire, England, where he trained to be a silver plate maker. He crossed the plains as a teenager as part of the first handcart company, was given the job of awakening the camp each morning by playing his cornet. Bailey's interest in music continued in Sanpete. He became leader of Ephraim's first band. Though he carved a number of gravestones alongside his teacher and brother-in-law, Parlin McFarlane, he was also a farmer, a bricklayer, and a civic leader, serving as both the city recorder and city treasurer. Among the gravestones Bailey carved in the late 1800s that remain today was a beautiful marker for his daughter, Carolyn, who died just before her 19th birthday. Notice the fine carving and distinctive design elements that are part of his artistic signature. The canopy at the top portion with flowering lettering for in memory of, the distinctive decorative carving that appears along the top edge and also below the epitaph. For the epitaph, Bailey chose a traditional quatrain about death that was popular in the eastern U.S. during this period of time and would have certainly originated and been popular in his native England. On to Manti. It's not always possible to attribute groups of markers to a specific carver, but it's fun to try. More than a dozen of the earliest markers in the Manti Cemetery are obviously the work of one hand, but whose hand is it? There were 6 stone cutters living in Manti during these 16 years, the span of the markers, who might have done the work. One fellow, George Pierce Billings, was from a family of stone workers who had helped build the Kirkland and Nauvoo temples, but I haven't found any references to gravestone carving, and he lived in Manti from 1849 to 1896. If he carved these markers, why didn't he continue beyond 1869? The next possibility is Elijah Everett, a well-known stoneworker who lived in Manti from 1850 to 62 when he was called to work in Dixie. But I have an example of his gravestone carving from Nauvoo, and it doesn't look anything like this. Welcome Chapman, who lived in Sanpete from 1850 to 65 when he was called to work on the Salt Lake Temple, worked with Perry at one point and did carve gravestones, and he reportedly carved his wife's marker as well as his own prior to his death. But once again, the styles don't match. Another possibility is Augustin E. Dodge, who came to Sanpete in 1850, but his departure to work in Dixie in 62 and the fact that he never returned to the area suggests that he left too early to have done this work. That includes death dates as late as 1869. A man named William Miles, who lived in Sanpete from 1860 to 1880, is another candidate, but unfortunately I can't find any other information about him. So I'm left with one more candidate, ta-da-da! And I hope this is who it is, and I hope someday I find some way to really confirm this. But the likelihood is high that this is his work. Jerome Bonaparte Kempton, isn't that a great name? Lived in Manti from 1850 to 1856 and again from 1862 to 69. Both times he left for work in Salt Lake, but he was living in this area during the right time for having carved these distinctive markers. So for now, I'm calling him the Manti carver. One of the earliest grave markers in this group is in the form of a cross, a very unusual style for a Mormon gravestone. This marker also features one of the defining characteristics of the Manti carver, the addition of a textured area, often along the bottom edge of the gravestone. Another defining element is the unusual treatment of the word sacred and the word memory. For both words, the Manti carver has used little spikes or cross marks to decorate and accent the letters. The Manti carver's work sometimes included epitaphs in the form of a poetic stanza that typically expressed a belief in eternal life. The verse on this beautiful marker for Alice Ware reads, "Farewell, my companion, my children and friends. I've gone to the kingdom where life never ends, now free from all sorrow, vexation, and care. For naught that can trouble can ever come there." Jerome Bonaparte Kempton, who came to Sanpete from New York State, was a multi-talented man listed in every Utah census as a stonecutter. He was also a blacksmith, gunsmith, and even an interpreter for the Indians. If indeed he was the Manti carver, he certainly left behind a legacy of beautiful hand-carved gravestones. As might be expected, some of the earliest Sanpete markers feature the same symbols that were used on 19th century temples and other early Mormon material culture. The sun, moon, and stars, all-seeing eye, beehive, clasp hands, and the words holiness to the Lord, as well as the compass and the square, all symbols of Masonic origin, are found on handmade objects throughout the Mormon region in the years after settlement. These grave markers featuring stars with 5, 6, or 7 points and the words holiness to the Lord were made by gravestone carver Wiley Payne Allred, an early resident of Spring City. Allred's gravestones are easily recognizable. Over 30 oolitic limestone markers still exist in Sanpete, the majority in Spring City, featuring his distinctive block lettering. Allred was born in Tennessee. His family joined the Mormon Church in 1830, 2 years before its official founding, and they experienced all the trials of Missouri and Nauvoo. He was known as a physician. His knowledge of setting bones and pulling teeth was widespread, and he was an expert in using and prescribing herbs, a lifelong interest that, according to family legend, was encouraged by Joseph Smith. Allred lived in Sanpete for approximately 30 years before moving over the mountain to Emory to help build up that region. Among his most impressive markers are the gravestones he carved for his parents. Elizabeth Warren and James Allred, founders of Allred Settlement, eventually known as Spring City. The backside of these markers feature the stars that Allred so frequently used, while the fronts are even more impressive. The marker for his mother on the left features a clock whose face reads 2:45, presumably the time of her death. His father's marker features 8 seven-pointed stars and a rare depiction of the sacred square and compass. Only one of 2 markers that I found with these symbols in the entire state, the second being another Allred marker in the lonely Fayette Cemetery. But the real find with these gravestones was W.P.'s signature at the bottom of his father's marker. Though the stone's damaged, I could still read W.P. Allred sculpt, a fact I later confirmed when I discovered an earlier image. Guess where? Online. You can see the signature there. There are many more gravestone carvers working in Sanpete during the 19th century than there's time to discuss today. Some were first-generation carvers who carved gravestones in styles that reflected their places of birth and training, and whose work is recognizable, but who may never be identified by name. Others were second-generation carvers, many following in their father's footsteps, who gradually switched with the times, carving in marble instead of limestone. They carved markers from rough trainloads of Vermont marble or added names and dates to pre-carved monuments that they ordered from eastern quarries. And as the population grew and carvers used more imported markers, the distinctive design elements found on early Sanpete gravestones and the symbols, like stars, began to disappear. They were gradually replaced with biblical symbols like the rose for love, lilies for resurrection, dove for the Holy Spirit, the lamb representing Christ, and wheat representing life, symbols with messages that Mormon population understood and wanted as they laid their loved ones to rest. But by the turn of the 20th century, a new technology became available, air-powered chisels. Carvers left behind their metal chisels and hammers and switched to granite, a material even harder than the marble that is still preferred for headstones today. Just like the marble markers that came into the region via the railroad, most but not all of these markers are imported, ready for name and dates to be added. But Sanpete monument makers, or monument dealers as they began to call themselves, continued to meet local taste by offering imagery with local meaning, like this 4-sided marker with a beehive, an ox-pulled wagon, and the words pioneer. Utah's pioneer gravestone carvers were not always identified as such in census records, or even in obituaries, journals, or family histories. Many were farmers, like most everyone in frontier times, and some also held public office. Among the group ultimately identified were physicians, musicians, actors, and inventors. Basically, they were jacks of all trade, but their work was creative and ranged from skilled to artistic, reflecting their training or lack of it and their native talent. They came from various places, reflecting the diverse population that settled Sanpete. Some were Americans, both Yankee and Southerners. Some were from the British Isles and others from Scandinavia. And this diversity is reflected in the variety of sizes, shapes, imagery, and carving styles. Many of them worked cutting stone for Mormon temples, not only Manti, but ones at Kirkland, Nauvoo, St. George, and Salt Lake. And having learned stonework by watching and studying the work of others, many passed their skills along to their sons, who worked alongside them and followed in their footsteps. These stone artists left a legacy, an unsurpassed wealth of beauty, artifacts that reflect and celebrate local heritage and culture. The hundreds of 19th century gravestones that they carved using just a hammer and chisel honor their family, friends, and neighbors, the hardworking people who settled this land and built the foundation of the communities and lives we now enjoy. And for us, they offer not only beauty, but also a better understanding of the challenges of frontier life and the complex nature of our pioneer past. These men truly did leave their mark, and it's our job today to value these beautiful pieces of art, help preserve them for the enjoyment of future generations. Thank you for listening to a voice going on and on and on. I know that's hard sometimes. Thank you very much.
Can you take some questions?
Sure. Happy if there are any questions.
So, how did family?
That was a lot of money. One of the other carvers I was studying, Charles Lambert, I found a journal entry about gravestones and their costs, and the markers he was making, which were pretty nice, were $40. That was in Salt Lake a little bit earlier. So the 151 must have been a big deal. But he mentioned that he took, it was in produce, $40 worth of produce and goods. So it wasn't always money. A lot of bartering. Yeah. Absolutely, that happened all the time, 19th century and 20th century. You can see it more easily on the 19th century stones because most often the carving style will be different. And sometimes you'll see a marker that appears to be the work of someone, but there's something off with the lettering. So maybe somebody else finished it. But today what they do is they have portable sandblasting units that they take to the cemetery afterward to add those later dates in, which is becoming more and more a necessity because more people are picking and even installing gravestones before they die.
Curious. How many?
Too many. Yeah.
How-
Yeah. Too many are going away, and it's, well, 30 years is not very long in the big scheme of things, but there are a lot that I've noticed we've lost. The slides these images are all from a digital camera. They were taken in the last year or so. But I have slides from earlier times for a lot of them. And what I see is a lot of deterioration, and also sometimes they're just gone. They're not there anymore. So we are losing them, and it's hard to know. It's too fast. It's hard to know what the rate is. It's really hard to know, too, what the solution is other than teaching people to value them and try and be careful and not destroy them purposefully. There are organizations that try to do gravestone preservation and with a variety of conflicting ideas about what needs to be done to save them. But I think the truth of the matter is there are so many of them that it's really hard to do anything but try and save some of the very best, but maybe more importantly, just document them and teach people to value them. They're going to go away because it's material that's just going to crumble over time. And if we can help slow that down by not watering them, that's one thing that would be really good. Yeah, it's kind of an overwhelming problem. I probably wouldn't brush it off because most of these markers and many of the oldest ones in the state are sandstone or limestone, and that would probably cause more damage than letting the lichen be there. The good news is we don't have that many in Utah with lichen because of our dry weather. And actually we have a real wealth of 19th century materials that are still left, partly because it was local stone and we do have dry weather. And these talented carvers were here so early on. We have a much deeper inventory of 19th century markers than surrounding states, like quite a bit. It's just like going downtown Salt Lake. You see incredible buildings that are very early for the West. And, that's part of our unique heritage. That's an interesting question, just because I've had a recent experience with it. I get so excited about this, and a lot of people really don't care. Sometimes I get in touch. I try really hard to get in touch with the descendants of some of these carvers. You know, when I find out, hey, there's a guy who really did a bunch of really cool stuff, and I think if that were my great grandfather, I'd want to know he did it. So I make some attempt to do that, and most of the time people are interested, and I'll run into somebody in the family who's a genealogist, and we'll have a little back and forth for a while, and we're pretty excited that we found all this stuff. And then other times I'll run into somebody who just doesn't care. And I don't get it. You know, it's like, I will send you 30 photos of these beautiful markers your great grandfather did. And they go, oh, okay, that'd be nice. I'll be in touch. So I think it's just, you know, whatever turns you on. That's nice, I think, because those markers are in much better shape than the ones that have been watered all these years. It's funny, too, there was a story, an early story in Salt Lake about water and cemeteries. The first, well, of course, the first bearers were right down here, but then they quickly moved up to the bench above the avenues and started that to be a burial area. And they desperately wanted water, but they did not have water for many, many years. But the Gentile cemetery, Mount Olivet, that was on federal land, had a well. So all the Gentiles were getting buried in the nice, lush, vegetative cemetery, and the Mormons were over here in the barren place, and it was it was one of those, well, you know, we got it on you. People came here with the idea that a cemetery was supposed to be a beautiful park-like, green, soothing, wonderful place. Because the rural cemetery movement had happened in the early 1800s on the East Coast, and that was the goal, was to move cemeteries from around churchyards in where markers were obscured and it wasn't a particularly fun place to contemplate, and to move them out and to create actual park-like spaces with water features and gardens and paths, so that it was a nice, calm, wonderful place to visit. So that was their ideal when they came, and they were really upset that they couldn't get the water. And, you know, over time, just about every cemetery in Utah does have water now. See that one on the left? Here, see. That's in Wales, on the west part of Sanpete County, which is a kind of an impoverished little farming community that's very, very small. So they haven't ever attempted to add grass. Good for them. I believe that's true, yeah. Yeah. Somebody, the question was when grass came to Sanpete cemeteries. I think someone could probably research that, because it would be in the city minutes, because a lot of cemetery information is in those city council minutes. I have a sense that it was late, like 1940s and 50s. And the reason I have that sense, well, two things. Sanpete County is kind of an impoverished county in comparison to the rest of the state. So I don't think that would have been on their priority list in terms of the money they could put into it. But secondly, my grandmother, my mother's family's from Twilla, and I used to hang out with my grandma a lot, and the cemetery was one of her stops every time I was out there. And I remember as a child, so this was in the 50s and early 60s, going to the cemetery, and it was still in family plots. It was all in a big grid, and the family was responsible for taking care of the vegetation, and there were little picket fences around a lot of the plots. That, I mean, I remember that. So that was probably as late as the mid-60s. So Twilla didn't have grass until after that. And they got rid of all the barriers and the vegetation, put in the grass. I'm guessing that it wouldn't have happened earlier in Sanpete.
Did that coincide with
Yeah, I believe it did. I believe it did.
which
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I bet you could go back in records in most towns and see an ongoing discussion about how terrible the cemetery looks and we need to do something about it for a decade or two, and then that switch. Yeah. Well, there's a solution. Maybe that's better than the weeds if you haven't got a time to mow them down. But, ooh, that's a good question. And I really don't know the answer to it, but I know I found some that are in the early 50s, 52, 53. But I don't know if I found anything earlier than that. There was a very well-known carver named William Ward who worked here in Salt Lake. He was Truman O. Angel's assistant. He was trained in architectural drawing, and he'd been trained as a sculptor in England in what was called subtractive sculpture. Anyway, there was an advertisement in probably 1853, 1854 in the Deseret News saying, "Well, I haven't got anything to do this winter. If any of you want gravestones, I'm available to carve them." And there are still a half dozen of his in the city cemetery that are absolutely gorgeous. But of course, really, really high-end stuff. But, that's really pretty permanent investment in a place 5, 6 years after arrival. And that is part of the story here, is that people came not to kind of make their fortune and move along if things didn't work out, but they came to stay, and they put down roots immediately. That's right. Yeah, you did the line on the land house. And a little footnote to that. The church museum's taken that lion, as well as the Thomas Tanner gravestone that William Ward did for the foreman of the blacksmiths on the Temple Square. That's a fiberglass facsimile of it. But they actually took the actual gravestone as well as the actual lion and put them in storage, and hired Hans Huttlinger and his son John, who are contemporary gravestone carvers, to sculpt replacements. So what we see above the door and in the cemetery are now the work of the Huttlingers. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, many of the cemeteries have areas where you can't do anything but a flat gravestone that they can just mow over. Part of the development of perpetual care. Yeah, it's too bad because the old upright vertical ones are so beautiful. Yeah. And, some of the gravestone some of the, what do they call themselves today? The monumentalists who run the companies and do contemporary gravestones. Up in Ogden, there are a number of brand new markers for pioneers and pioneer families that are mammoth, or, like great big pyramid things that are done out of granite with sandblasting as a replacement stone for the old vertical markers. It's in an area where you can still do vertical stuff. So they've replaced the old beautiful markers that have crumbled or whatever with these giant granite markers. And the thing, it's sad, but the thing that's good about it is they just fill them with all kinds of information. You find people's biographies, stories of faith, photographs, all kinds of family history, and they're these giant monuments to our ancestors. And it's because the sandblasting allows them to do anything on the marker, not just 5 or 10 symbols that you've learned how to carve with your hand, but you can do anything on the granite because you use latex stencils and a sandblasting tool. So they're amazing. You know, they really commemorate these people on many, many levels. I'm not sure. I think that there were a lot of them in the 19th century, probably at the turn of the century. I would guess that when they started doing the more of the marble ones that came from outside, that maybe wouldn't have a corresponding footstone. And when they switched to granite, that's when they quit using the footstones. Most of them, of course, have just been lost. I mean, that was the easy part, to get lost. So it's really fun when you do find one. I know it was a British thing, and I'm sure it's an East Coast thing. I don't know if it was a Scandinavian thing or not. Yeah. I do have a sense that that folks went to their own for the gravestones. You can see, excuse me, you can see with Wiley P. Allred's markers that there were a lot of typical American names on his markers. And you can see with the ones in this old Ephraim Cemetery that the majority of the markers there are the Breinholts, they're Danish, and many, many of the names are Scandinavian. So I kind of think, you know, they went to who they knew and knew the kind of marker they would have had back home. Yeah. So it's nice to have that diversity and see it in the different cemeteries in Sanpete. Mount Olivet Cemetery, that's the atypical cemetery for Utah, the Gentile cemetery. Check it out. There's a bunch of amazing mausoleums and statuary that has been imported and all kinds of things. And that's where you'll find most of the above ground burials in Utah. You know, I don't know. Does someone know what's in Monroe? Just want to confuse us. Okay, it worked. I saw one more question over here. Typically, no. They were municipal cemeteries. The way Utah developed with the little towns are being established and everybody working as a group, they'd pick a place to have the cemetery. And it wasn't part of the church grounds or whatever. The one different place in Utah would be the city cemetery, and you can see a number of cemeteries up there for different groups, including a Jewish area and a Catholic area. And there aren't really churches there, but I'm thinking about the Chinese, isn't there a Chinese mausoleum up there, I think? Maybe I'm wrong. It might just be like a mortuary building. Yeah, you guys know about that. So there's not really any kind of church. It's just like an altar. Where was that church? Just sometime downtown somewhere?
I think it's where the market
Hmm. Yeah. Cool. I didn't know anything about that. Thanks. Interesting. Yeah. Thank you all very, very, very much.
Thank you, Carol. That was fascinating. I think you can see the level of interest by the number of questions that came up afterwards. So thank you very much for that. And we have lectures every Wednesday this month for Archives Month. So invite everybody to come back to our other lectures. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Carol.